Well, I am 75 years old, meaning I am an old man. I was born in Argentina, but my family translocated to Chile. And in Chile, I was in the Hebrew school in Santiago, which at the time was a Zionist school also. So I decided to come and study in Israel. I came to Israel in 1966 and started studying in the Hebrew University with all the difficulties of the new immigrants, meaning my Hebrew was good for Chile but not good enough for the Hebrew University. So I had to learn English very quickly because I understood that most of the study material was in English. Studied economics and political science, and then I left economics for history, and I finished a BA in political science and history, and then I did a master's degree in history, and then I did a PhD in political science under the direction of late Professor Zev Sterner, who was one of the great experts on fascism in the world. Not only in Israel he was probably the great expert in fascism, but he was considered the great expert in Europe, in the USA, and everywhere. And my PhD thesis became part of a book that we co-authored with Zev Sterner. That's called, in English, it's called The Birth of Fascist Ideology, La naissance de l'idéologie fasciste. That was the original in French, and since now it has been translated to 8 languages, and they keep selling it. Then I worked for 2 years in the political science department of the University of Haifa, and I came back to Jerusalem, and all my career, my academic career, was at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And what the Chinese call an interesting period, meaning the interesting period in Israel lasts since the day I arrived here. There is almost no day with news that take you out of balance, but make life extremely interesting. You see, it's the negative and positive parts, because I really believe that Israel after this war will be another country. The British mandate succeeded Ottoman Rule. And Ottoman Rule, as we perceive it now, had advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of Ottoman Rule was probably based in the system of Millet. The system of Millet was awarding autonomy on a religious basis to different parts of the population. And that somehow worked on a multi-religious, multinational, multi-ethnic, and multi-everything empire. And the Ottoman Empire, as long as the subject peoples, besides the Ottoman Turks, say the Arabs, the Jews, the Christians, different denominations of Christians, and many others, paid taxes and went to the army when they were called and obeyed the authorities in general, they let them live their lives. We can argue that it is a medieval system of ruling, and it's perhaps true, but it worked, and it worked for a very long time. The disadvantages were clear. The Ottoman Empire was broken financially. Politically, it was weak and very unstable. They had suffered revolutions. They had many internal problems. They perceived some of the minorities, especially the Armenians at that time, as potential deadly enemies of the empire, and so forth. They were highly corrupt also. meaning that meritocracy and progress couldn't function because at every step they clashed with the corrupt functionaries of the empire, and things went wrong, basically. The southern part of the province of Syria, that was called in the Ottoman Empire, or Palestine, which was another name for this area, was deeply poor, underdeveloped, and abandoned, we can say. And it became central only in the First World War because the Ottoman drive to take the Suez Canal that failed twice, and then the British drive to take Palestine. And the British succeeded, and they were between the winners, the victorious parts of the First World War, and they established a military rule in what was called Palestine. And after 4 years, 3.5 years, they were awarded a mandate by the League of Nations, the President of the United Nations, and the mandate charter said that basically what the British Empire had to do was not to colonize this area of the world, but prepare the populations for independence and democratic rule. That was more or less the spirit of the mandate.
So they were babysitters.
In a certain sense, babysitters, educators, developers, because they brought Western ways of doing things and progress, and Palestine, or what will be Israel during the British rule, changed very much. It changed physically and it changed mentally because it became part of the British Empire, and the British Empire was modern, and the British Empire built infrastructures here and organized the country in the way of the British Empire. You see, they established a British police and British courts and British education system and health system, etc., etc. So hospitals, everything changed here. And then, in parallel, there was the influx of the Zionist movement that had a very clear goal, which was to establish, at the end of this process, to establish an independent Jewish state. And they did what we know. They developed agriculture. They went along with a British development and did some more things for the for the Jewish community that was growing constantly through immigration in Palestine, Israel, let's call it. Let's make a pause and go back and remark that clashes between Jews and Arabs, territorial clashes, were frequent already at the end of the 19th century. Meaning, if we have to put a date on the start of the modern conflict, which is not a religious conflict like some people would like it to be, it has religious components, undoubtedly, but the nature is not, it doesn't come from the Bible. After biblical times, Old Testament, New Testament, Jews and Arabs lived for many centuries, sometimes in peace, sometimes no, but they lived like normal people, one on the side of the other, without real political institutions on either side, or when one side had political institutions, which was the Arab side, they established clearly what was the status of the Jews, and the Jews were protected by the state also. They were second-class citizens, Dima, but they were protected as long as they obeyed, they paid taxes, etc., and went to the army. They were protected by the state also. But here, with the entry of Zionism into the picture and the idea of a Jewish state as against the idea of the large Arab state that Arab nationalism dreamed about around the First World War. We all know the story, and we all, I hope, have seen Lawrence of Arabia. If you need a nice illustration for it, then clashes began. First of all, socially, one side interfering with the other, robbing, etc., and afterwards politically. We can say that after the First World War, the clashes already had a political character, both on the Arab side and on the Jewish side, because both sides, and also with the support of the British, became more and more organized because they needed to put their needs in front of the British rulers. But the Jewish side organized much more rapidly, much more efficiently, and much more Westernly, progressively I would say, than the Arab side. So meaning that by the 1920s, the institutions of the future state of Israel were already established and functioned. In Zionism, there was a belief that lasted perhaps until the 30s, with some groups until the establishment of the state, and even longer, that the immigration of Jews into this territory of British Palestine would work to the benefit of both sides, that high levels of cooperation could be established. There was a political side to it, which was the Faisal-Weizmann agreement that took place within the framework of the Versailles treaties at the end of the First World War in 1919. And there was a declaration, a common declaration of the two sides that this thing could work with mutual cooperation as long as neither side overstepped the rights of the other side. Therefore, the amount of clashes in the 20s and in the 30s, and especially the Palestinian Revolt in 1936 to 1939, convinced a group of people around David Ben-Gurion that there is no way of cooperating with Palestinian nationalism at that time. And I don't enter in the discussion whether there was Palestinian nationalism or not, but the revolt was a Palestinian revolt, and it had a very high cost in blood, because the British repressed this rebellion in ways that Israel until today wouldn't dare to do. They killed many thousands of Palestinians, and they sent into exile the political leadership. And this is one of the reasons why what was left as a political leadership was led by Jamin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, who escaped. He was an exile, and as an exile he was in Iraq when the Iraqi revolt against the British took place in the framework of the Second World War, and afterwards he was in Italy, and afterwards he was in Berlin with Hitler, and he cooperated in the name of his faction of Palestinian nationalism. He made it appear as he represented all Palestinian nationalism and cooperated with the Nazis and with the fascists. But the other side, and I mentioned Ben-Gurion and the group of people around him, who led the institutions of the future state, between them Haganah, the underground army, Histadrut, the workers' organization, and all its branches which could be translated in modern terms to ministries in the government of Israel. No? The branch about education, the branch about infrastructure development, Solel Boneh, the branch about that took care of health, Kupat Cholim, etc., etc., etc. So Ben-Gurion got convinced that the moment the Jewish side, Zionist side, will try to establish a state, the Arab side will reject the state and there will be a war. So he concentrated, and his people concentrated in preparing the future state of Israel for a war. And I am talking about 1936, 1937, meaning that they had 10 years in which they could prepare against the will of the British and sometimes with British cooperation, because the British attitude towards Zionism and towards Arab nationalism went along the British interests. You see, all the rest is a fairy tale. It's not that the British were pro-Zionist or pro-Arab. They were pro-Zionist or pro-Arab according to their interests, which is the normal way states behave in general. So we had the White Book forbidding Jewish immigration and Jewish land buying, which was very important. But on the other side, we had the British creating the Palmach, what would be the elite of the Haganah of the Jewish underground army, in order to defend this country if the Germans, through North Africa or through the Caucasus, Russia, arrived to the Middle East. Therefore, you can't, my view of the British is that they try to do their best for their side. And many Jewish immigrants to Palestine were recruited into the British Army in the Second World War, and the British also established the Jewish Brigade within the frame of the British Army. So they did things in favor and against all the time. For instance, we know about the negotiations between Golda Meir, then one of the collaborators of Ben-Gurion, and King Abdallah I of Jordan. But it didn't work. It didn't work because the Arab League supported the Palestinian side and because the Palestinian side was led by radicals. This is why I told you that the impact of the rebellion, of the Palestinian rebellion 36-39, was so important for the future of the non-Palestinian state. Maybe if other politicians, but the Mufti of Jerusalem, but Hajj Amin al-Husseini, would have taken command of the Palestinian national movement, maybe a kind of compromise could have been elaborated. But history doesn't work this way. You see, you do something and the consequences may come 10 years afterwards, but they come. You can't stop them. And I can't blame the British, because in the 36-39, the British did what, according to their interest, was logical to do. And there are many interesting things about that. And there is even, between the Israeli historians, there is Tom Segev, that remembers the time of the Kalanioticals, the Red Berets, the British paratroopers, with emotion, and he says it was a very good time, we lived very well under the British mandate, or something like that. I am vulgarizing, of course, the argument is much more complicated. But yes, all along the history of Israel, there were opportunities, but they were, I can't say that they were missed on purpose by this or the other side. There is another thing that most of people in Israel today are not taught in school, or they ignore. Israel had, during most of its existence, since the first years of the inception of the State of Israel, Israel had a special office in Switzerland that maintained all kinds of links with different Arab countries. That was, of course, secret, as many of the operations of leading to peace of the Mossad were secret afterwards. You know, everyone knows about Mossad's defensive violent actions against this or that. People don't know that Mossad and the Foreign Affairs Ministry did a lot of things in order to try to assuage the relations between the Arabs and the Jews with different measures of success. When the Abraham Accords were signed, Abraham Agreements were signed, there was a lot of preparation work during like 10 years done this way. You see, there was not a sudden coming of this thing, as a lot of contacts were established also with Egypt along the years, and even after the 73 war, there were a secret approach under the patronage of Ceausescu in Romania, under the patronage of the King of Morocco, etc., etc. So preparations and secret negotiations, and always secret negotiations, because whatever comes to the surface becomes part of the internal political debate in Israel and in the Arab countries, and then it blows up.
Yes.
Only the package, the final package, can be presented, and then people can see if the advantages are more than the disadvantages or the contrary, and accept it or not. Now, all this has been taken place with the knowledge and mostly, I would say, without the knowledge of the people in Israel and in the Arab countries. And we succeeded in establishing a peace treaty with Egypt, in establishing a peace treaty with Jordan, in establishing the Abraham Accords with the Gulf states, and afterwards with Morocco, and with Sudan. They are in the cooking, because Sudan is cooking into a civil war that they don't seem to be able to finish it. And they were approaches to different countries. So the situation is very different today than it was in 48. In 48, there was total rejection about Israel in the Arab world. Today, we were even talking before the 7th of October of a reapproachment and normalization with Saudi Arabia, which is one of the most important Arab states. And after that, the sky was the limit, if it was possible. Quite obvious, but you have to introduce two other factors that we didn't mention, strangely, until now, that are Iran and petroleum. See, Saudi Arabia is the first world producer and exporter of petrol, and they can control the price of petrol, and by controlling the price of petrol, they have a very strong influence in the world economy. This is something that has to be taken in consideration all the time. Iran is also an oil producer, but much smaller than Saudi Arabia. Iran has entered with the Iranian theocratic regime since 1979, and a period of local or trial of local predominance and expansion. Unfortunately, the way they are doing it is through a terror network that extends all along the Middle East. They patronize Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is a deadly enemy of Israel. They patronize the Houthi in Yemen, that also have shown their enmity against Israel. They patronized different groups in Syria. They supported the Bashar Assad regime in the Syrian civil war. and you can continue. And they have done, they have attacked Jewish and Israeli objectives all around the world. They
So they're not very friendly.
No, as a matter of fact, I would say that there is like a subterranean or a tacit, non-declared, non-openly fought war between Israel and Iran, all the time led through terrorism and through the frequent Israeli attacks in Syria to Iranian objectives that generally have to do with the supply of modern weapons to Hezbollah or to other pro-Iranian organizations in Syria, which may become dangerous for Israel, may be dangerous for Israel. So, with these two things, it is clear that the Arab states that are Sunni feel menaced by the expansionist politics or attitude of Iran into the Middle East, which is mostly Arab, not Iranian. And the rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia is connected to this global picture. Now, you said the Russians and the Chinese, etc., they are very large players, and the USA also, and we have them present here in the Middle East. You see, the Russians have the Tartus naval base in Syria, they have the Medinin air base in Syria, and they have 83 points where they sit in Syria with their intelligence, armed forces, etc., etc. They are deeply involved in the Middle East, and the Americans also. The Americans are present in eastern Syria, they are present in Iraq. Until today, they are very present in what would be called Kurdistan, or the Kurdish autonomous area. And the Chinese are trying to enter, even Israel, with the construction of a port in Haifa that finally went into the hands of a large Indian concern. India also slowly it's coming near to the Middle East for the same reasons that everyone wants to have better supply of oil from one side and cheaper if possible. So then, as a matter of fact, this war with Israel potentially can develop into an international or global conflict, because the Americans, the USA, has sent 2 task groups and 1 nuclear submarine to the Middle East. The Russians are in Syria. The Chinese have developed relations, very good relations, with Iran and with Saudi Arabia, and they have brought about a kind of peaceful reconciliation, very fragile, between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is interested in good relations with Israel because they know that Israel is the political military factor that is able to stop Iran from keep expanding into the Middle East terroristically, militarily, or diplomatically. So the picture is a very complex one, and this adds to what I said at the beginning. You see, the Middle East after this war, Israel after this war, has to be different, and the Middle East has to be different, because if not, if it continues to have the explosive potential that it has now, it will always be a focus of attacks in which a very weak and terrorist part will try to declench the global conflict in order to advance its own goals. Then my conclusion as a political scientist is always will be the same, that conflicts end by negotiation. Negotiations are unpleasant. You pay political prices to obtain certain agreements that promise a certain level of stability, but are not a complete guarantee about the future. Nobody can guarantee the future. And every side ends the negotiations and the agreements not totally satisfied or believing that it has paid a terrible price, but this is better than the alternative, because the alternative is war. And war we have now, and in the war what we are doing or is happening to us, that a lot of blood is being spilled around. And it's pointless because of the central conflict. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict is going nowhere. Israel is unable to work out a military solution to defeat the Palestinian side in such a way that they'll never claim anything more again. Even declaratively, the Israeli government says every day, our war is not against the Palestinian people, it's against the Palestinian terrorist organizations. So, even if many parts of the political Israeli scenario don't like the idea of agreeing something with the Palestinians, it is the logical solution, because the Palestinians are not going anywhere, and we, the Israelis, are not going anywhere either. And keep spilling blood doesn't lead to anywhere. Therefore, political agreements, as unsatisfactory as they may be, are a better alternative than keeping fighting all the time for unattainable goals. Yes, I'll agree that the extremists on both sides, see Hamas, Jihad Islami, the other, and in the Israeli side, the people that believe that there is no place for the Palestinians in this land, and there are extreme religious, nationalist, even messianic people, believe on zero-sum games. Well, zero-sum games, per definition, are anti-political. And I am a political scientist, therefore I don't believe in zero-sum games where people are involved, unless you have the kind of ideology that says that you have to eliminate physically all the people in the other side, which is not my way of seeing the world. My way of seeing the world is coexistence. We have to try to find out, and I'm not a pacifist. I have been to the Israeli army, I have done my duty on my time, my son does the same, my grandson will go in a couple of years, so we are not a pacifist family. We have done what our country required us to do. Still, looking at the conflict, looking back and looking at what's happening today, I say things need to change in the Middle East. And since the problem is global, the solution has to be global also.